Hi everyone, Will here with History in Bits. Welcome to part 2 of my 3-part series on Punch-Out!, the Nintendo boxing franchise. In part 1 we talked about the original arcade games and how the series got started in the first place, so today we're going to talk about the original home console releases on the NES and SNES, which are going to be, of course, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! And Super Punch-Out!. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So first off, we're going to talk about Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, which came out back in 1987 on the original NES. It's obviously the most popular game in the franchise, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are people out there who think it's the only game in the franchise because of how much more of a mainstream following it has than the other games. Jinyo Takeda, who we talked about in the first video as being the creator of the series and the director of the original 2 games, continued on to direct this game when it came to home consoles. It was developed by Nintendo R&D 3, which is the studio at Nintendo that Takeda directed at the time, which later became Integrated Research and Development, which is one of the major hardware divisions of Nintendo. Worked a lot on things such as the N64, the GameCube, Wii U, and so on. So originally the game was just Punch-Out!, and Mike Tyson wasn't added in to the game until very late in development. In fact, there's a version available that came out of Japan known as the Gold Cart, which is simply labeled Punch-Out! And doesn't have Mike Tyson in the game. It wasn't an official release of the game because it was only available to winners of the US Golf Course Famicom tournament they were having at the time, and was also given away as a prize in raffles and things like that. So the difference between the gold cart and the version that eventually came out is, well, for one, of course, the cart is golden, but also Bald Bull is found on the cover instead of Mike Tyson, and if you play through the game, Super Macho Man is the last fight in the game, and there is no dream fight against Mike Tyson at the end. So how did Mike Tyson get his likeness added into the game? Well, the way that happened is that the founder and president of Nintendo of America saw Tyson fighting in person and thought he was very impressive and wanted to add him into the game. And there's no official numbers out of what the contract was that they signed, but it's rumored to be worth about $50,000, and it was a 3-year contract that ran out in 1990 for Mike Tyson's likeness in the game. Now, $50,000 is quite a steal for Mike Tyson, and the reason that they got him for that price is because at the time they signed the contract, he was not yet the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. So it was really a good move on Nintendo to go ahead and pick him up, because obviously his name brought a lot of popularity to the game at the time. So when bringing Punch-Out! To a home console on the NES, one thing they had to change was the look and graphics of the game. This was of course because the NES was not nearly as powerful or had the graphical fidelity of the arcade machines that they were running the games on before. Now, the art director was officially Makoto Wada. However, he himself has said that he had very little to do with the project as he was new to the company and wasn't really allowed to touch much of the game, and Jinyo Takeda did much of the art himself. However, one thing Wada did sneak in was, if you ever play the game, you've noticed that Mario, of course, is the referee. And Wada snuck this into the development of the game, and it was never approved by anybody, but somehow it made it through the final release, and Miyamoto didn't even know about it until he saw it. So also introduced in Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Is Little Mac, who is the only named player character in the Punch-Out! Series. Back in arcades, the players played as that crazy looking wireframe green haired guy and only put in initials to be his name. So Little Mac was introduced, and he was, as his name suggests, very little. Standing next to his opponents, they absolutely towered over him, and the reason for this is the same reason that the characters in the arcade games were wireframe, and that is because Little Mac, being so small, allowed players to see past him and see the opponents in that from behind the back perspective that all the games are in. So Nintendo also added some gameplay changes to Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, and one of these changes was the Star Punch system. In the Star Punch system, when the player landed a punch when the opponent was particularly vulnerable, then they earned stars. And when they had these stars, they could press the start button anytime to try to throw a uppercut. And when throwing an uppercut, it would go through the opponent's blocks and immediately land, and it also did more damage than a normal punch. However, it was hard to keep a hold on these stars because, for one, they got used when you through the uppercut, but also whenever the opponent landed a punch on the player, you would lose 1 star. They also introduced the heart system, which was kind of a stamina system, in which the player starts with a certain number of hearts, and each time they throw a punch at the opponent which is blocked, 1 heart is used. Eventually, if you run out of hearts, Little Mac is blinking and he cannot throw any more punches, and the only way to gain more hearts is to dodge or duck punches that the opponent is throwing. Blocking does not work. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out was the first Punch-Out game to have some semblance of a story, with Little Mac and his trainer Doc Lewis, who was also introduced in this game. There were cutscenes in between title bouts that showed Doc Lewis and Little Mac training, running across New York as you see the skyline and the Statue of Liberty in the background, and Doc Lewis and the opponents would both have lines of text that would show up as what they were saying in between rounds in each match. Doc Lewis giving tips or saying don't give up, and the opponent usually trash talking in some way or another. Now, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out also has what is, in my opinion, some of the best music in the Punch-Out series, and in fact some of the best music on the NES in general. I mean, how can you listen to this and not be ready to fight somebody? Also, speaking of sound, there was no voiceover in the games as there were in the original arcade games. Eventually, Mike Tyson's contract ran out in 1990, but the game was still very popular and they wanted to re-release it, so they simply re-released it as just Punch-Out and changed Mike Tyson to Mr. Dream, who was essentially the same character but no longer named Mike Tyson. This is the version that is available on Virtual Console on the Wii, the Wii U, and the 3DS, and it is referred to as Punch-Out featuring Mr. Dream. So moving on from Punch-Out on the NES back in the 80s, let's go all the way up to 1994 with the Super Nintendo and the release of Super Punch-Out. Now, Nintendo R&D 3 still developed the game, and Genyo Takeda still produced it. However, he stepped down from directing and handed over the reins to Makoto Wada, the same guy who we just talked about not really being allowed to touch anything on the original Punch-Out on NES. So the technology of the SNES allowed the guys at Nintendo to create more of a port of the arcade version of Super Punch-Out instead of having to reimagine the entire series like they did with Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. They would have better graphics that resembled the arcade versions, and they had the ability to add voiceover in. They didn't do it exactly like the arcade version. They added in voiceover for boxers, the announcer, and the referee. Early photos and trailers for the game showed the player character still being Little Mac from Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. However, when the game actually came out, the player character was this nameless, blonde-haired guy that wasn't tiny and was a full-sized fighter. The way they made that work was to have him be partially transparent using some of the newer technology on Super Nintendo, which still allowed players to see the opponent very well during the game. And like I said, this game was mostly just a port of the arcade version. They did add some more characters, and they all fit in with the original Super Punch-Out. So that's it for part 2, guys. Hope you found this video informative. Please feel free to leave any comments you have below, and also any suggestions you have for a new series. Part 3 on Punch-Out will be coming out soon. We're going to talk about the Wii release of Punch-Out, and we're also going to talk about all of the strange spin-offs and games that were never released in the Punch-Out series or that came from the Punch-Out series. So again, thank you for watching. Have a great day.